In the Middle Ages, the church dominated people's lives, just as it dominates this town of Montmorillon in central France. They didn't build churches like this just because they looked pretty. They were symbols of the power the church exercised over every aspect of society. Obviously, the church couldn't keep up as original opposition to marriage. It made more sense to take it over. But this wasn't that easy. You see, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, marriages weren't really religious ceremonies. They were more like business agreements between families, bringing their estates together. And small children would have their future partners chosen for them by their parents. So, in the 12th century, the Pope intervened in a rather surprising way. He played the incest card. He declared that marrying a relative was a sin, and not just a close relative, but any relative, to within 11 degrees of consanguinity. That means you couldn't marry anyone with whom you shared a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparent without the church's permission, which of course came at a price. Everyone suddenly discovered there was about 250,000 people in their neighbourhood whom they couldn't marry. And in a little town like Montmorillon, population maybe 500, that could be a bit of a problem. The church may have taken over the business of marriage, but you still couldn't expect it to be exactly enthusiastic about sex. And it wasn't. Chastity was still the preferred relationship between the sexes, even in marriage. And marriage itself still remained outside the church's official remit. It wasn't until the middle of the 16th century that the church finally made the marriage oath into a sacrament that had to be performed by a priest. It had taken over 1,500 years for the church to allow marriage into its own ritual. And maybe that wasn't so surprising, because Christianity was a man's business in a man's world, and women were regarded as lesser human beings. Faulty and inferior, females were merely the property of men, like farm animals. It may come as a bit of a surprise to learn that European attitudes towards women improved somewhat as a result of its encounter with Islam. Now, I know that nowadays we tend to think of traditional Islam as repressive towards women, but back in the 12th century, things looked a bit different. The Islamic tradition is that women should be concealed but honoured, and honouring women was something that was decidedly not part of the medieval church's agenda. The encounter between the Crusaders, who came from the rather brutal and sexually repressed lands of Christendom, with the exotic and romantic courts of Islam, changed Europe more than it changed the Middle East. One of the greatest sexual revolutions in history took place in this actual hall. For hundreds of years, the church had been reinforcing the stereotype of the sinful Eve, a woman as inferior and subordinate to men. But here in Poitiers, in France, there was one woman who thought this had gone on for long enough, at least as far as she was concerned. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was a very feisty lady. She was beautiful, charismatic, and sexy. But she was also married to the King of France, who wasn't. He was, well, Eleanor herself put it like this. She said, "I thought I'd married a man, but I find I've married a monk." They were not a happy couple. Eleanor clearly wanted more sex than Louis was offering, and she also wanted more power. And she realized that the two of them went together. She had a storming love affair with this chap, who was then the Duke of Normandy. His name was Henry. She had her marriage to Louis annulled, on the grounds of incest, of course, and married him. The following year, Henry made himself King of England and Eleanor Queen. And this is the palace the two of them built here in Poitiers. In it, Eleanor established an entirely new kind of court. She called it the Court of Love. Eleanor was trying to turn the tide of Christian anti-feminism. In her court, women were not just the equal of men, women ruled. they became unattainable objects of adoration, desired, fought over, longed for, but always just out of reach. And this suited Eleanor down to the ground. You see, she enjoyed surrounding herself with handsome young knights who flirted with her, but at a safe distance. After all, she was a married woman, and her husband Henry was not a pussycat. But that was the point. The courtly lover was always wooing a married woman, a woman who was somebody else's property, sometimes even his own overlord's. And in this way, the laws of courtly love challenged not just the church, but the feudal lordship itself. The language they spoke was descended from what the Romans spoke. It was the Romans' language, or Romance. And in the stories and poems that were recited in Eleanor's court, wars and heroic male battles with bad men and monsters were replaced with stories about love between men and women. It was the beginning of an entirely new kind of literature, and we still call it by the same name, Romance. I swear to you on my faith, without you my joy is lost. When you are out of my sight, I pine away to death. Instead of repressing the power of sex, as the church had sought to do, Eleanor's court of love tried to harness sex into a civilizing force. The all-male virtues of killing one another were to be rechanneled into acts of love. The old battle stories about King Arthur, for example, were rewritten as a romantic saga about the adulterous love between Lancelot and Guinevere. Of course, for noblemen, the favoured form of self-expression was still violent physical contact with each other. But now they did it for the sake of a lady. This was what transformed the tournament from a full-scale mock war into an elegant jousting contest. The object originally had been to take prisoners and ransom them. Now it was to win a lady's favour.